Bismillah, in this next section, we're going to be looking at something that is not explicitly mentioned by our author in the textbook, Umdat al-Talib by the great Imam al-Buhuti, rahimahullah ta'ala. He does, however, of course, address this issue in his other works, namely the explanation of Muntal Iradat as well as al-Iqna'. And the reason that I'm mentioning this now outside of the scope of what we would typically cover is because I do believe it's a rather important topic. And to be thorough, I think it's fair that we dive a little deeper into this particular subject matter, and that is determining the beginner's menstrual cycle, the first timer, if you will. Essentially, this means that a young woman has not had a menstrual cycle previously, and now she's experiencing her initial menstrual cycle or flow of blood. So when a girl who is at least 9 years of age, if you remember that's the minimum age that one can be for any blood that flows to be considered menstrual blood, when she first sees blood, regardless the color, whether it's yellowish discharge or brownish discharge, or any other color of blood, she is to stop prayer, fasting, tawaf, i'tikaf, and any other activity which requires being in a state of purification. And she has to stop for its least possible period, its least possible time frame. And we've learned that that is a day and a night, 24 hours. So long as the blood is flowing for that period of time and more, she has to stop her prayer, etc., for a day and a night. And then after that 24-hour period expires, she performs ghusl, right, for the sake of that blood flow. And then she continues to pray, etc., even if the blood continues to flow afterwards. So long as it does not exceed the maximum time frame, which is 15 days and nights, when the blood stops, when it stops flowing, which would be typically 6 or 7 days later, as we've learned, that's the average cycle according to what's been witnessed as well as documented in our text, she's obliged to perform another ghusl. So basically what we're looking at is the first initial flow of blood. If it goes beyond a day and a night, she is to stop performing prayer, tawaf, all of the things that require ritual purification for a 24-hour period, perform ghusl after that 24-hour period, and then continue to pray, to fast, etc., even if blood is still flowing, so long as it does not exceed 15 days. And then after the blood flow stops, she performs ghusl and carries on. She does this for 3 menstrual cycles. Okay, you let 3 menstrual cycles go by. Remember that the minimum time for purification is 13 days. So any blood that's perhaps seen before that, 13 days passes, is not to be counted as menstrual blood. This is based on this scenario, and this should be noted, this is min mufradat al-madhab. This is from the unique rulings of the school, doing it in this way, in that you would stop praying and fasting, etc., for a day and a night, and then you would continue even with the flow of blood, because the other schools of thought will have her stop praying and fasting, etc., while blood is flowing. In a general manner, without getting into the details of the various different types of things could potentially happen. However, so to note that this particular method of the Hanabila here with the initial determination of a menstrual cycle for the beginner, the first timer, this is based on the Prophet ﷺ saying, forego prayer on the days of your menstrual cycles. Forego the prayers on the days of your menstrual cycles. It's because he mentioned cycles in the plural form, it's understood that this is at least 3. This is the minimum to be considered a plural linguistically. In the Arabic language, the plural form is at least 3. And so we've taken this 3 as the minimum to establish a regular reoccurring cycle. 3 cycles is also needed to establish the required repetition. And this time frame is what determines a regular menstrual cycle and establishes certainty regarding the blood which flows during that time. And this is essentially what we need. We need to establish certainty regarding that period of blood flow. What type of blood is it? Okay. Should be noted that the cycle, the menstrual cycle, consists of the days which the blood flows and the days which it stops, and are within the time frame to be legally deemed as either menstrual blood or a state of purity, meaning there's no blood flowing. So the rationale of this process is that the prayer is a certain obligation which cannot be forgone due to doubt. When a young woman has her first menstrual cycle, she is uncertain of its actual duration. So in this scenario, we know with certainty that blood flowing for a day and night is legally deemed menstrual blood. If she's reached the age of 9 or more, we know that blood flowing for at least a day and a night, a 24-hour period, is deemed to be menstrual blood. But what happens after that, we're uncertain. It could be menstrual blood, or it could be something else. It could be pseudo-menstruation, which is istihala. And because it takes 3 cycles to determine the usual normal cycle that we would adhere to after it's established, we cannot achieve the level of certainty required to forego prayer, etc., fasting, whatever it may be. Should be noted, though we may be praying still, our women folk may be praying while blood is still flowing, regardless the case, intercourse during that time, the time blood is flowing, without having established a normal cycle is impermissible due to the likelihood that it is menstrual blood, right? So we are not foregoing prayer and fasting, the obligations, due to the likelihood that it's not menstrual blood, and we're avoiding intercourse due to the likelihood that it is menstrual blood, or I should say the possibility that it's not menstrual blood and the likelihood that it is menstrual blood. So after the completion of 3 consecutive cycles, she adopts the repeated time frame of blood flow as her usual cycle and now foregoes prayer, etc. for that duration. For example, if she sees blood for 5 days in the first month, 6 days in the second, and 7 days in the third, her normal cycle is 5 days. Remember, 5 days in the first, 6 in the second, and 7 in the third. It would be a 5-day cycle because it was 5 days of bleeding that regularly occurred during those 3 cycles. The additional day in the second month and the 2 additional days in the third month, they did not repeat 3 times to establish a normal cycle of being 6 days or being 7 days. And this is the case even if the least amount of days occurs in the middle, meaning the middle cycle. So for example, the first cycle was 6, the second cycle was 5, and the third cycle was 7, which is the minimum number that repeated. It's still 5. And that happened in the first because 5 and then an additional day is 6, then 5 in the middle, and then 7, 2 additional days in the third cycle. So this is the case even if the least amount of days occurs in the middle or end of the 3-cycle period of determination. Right, so again, to highlight this example of what would happen here in this case, if she sees blood for 6 days in the first month, 7 days in the second, and 5 days in the third, her normal cycle is 5 days because it was 5 days of bleeding that regularly occurred during those 3 cycles. So there you can see, I've given you examples of each variety that could have happened where the minimum was at the first cycle, at the second cycle, and then potentially at the third cycle, all establishing the same outcome, which is a 5-day cycle. The additional days would be considered irregular bleeding and treated like istihala or pseudo-menstruation. With this determination now, she would now forego prayer, etc. for 5 days in the subsequent 4th cycle. So basically after that 3rd cycle, her next cycle, she knows her normal menstrual cycle is a 5-day period. In the following month, she would observe a 5-day menstrual cycle, and any other bleeding that happened, a day or 2, she would not consider it menstrual blood. It would be pseudo-menstruation, and so she would not forego prayer, fasting, etc. during those extra days. Now, after we've established that, we need to go back. We need to kind of rewind. So it's important that the first timer is keeping track of the days that she was required to fast, for example, because we have to go back now. Once our regular cycle is established, she would be required to make up any days that she fasted while bleeding that can now be identified as her normal cycle. So in the event that we recognized it's a 5-day cycle, and let's say that initial time that she was bleeding, the first cycle, it was during Ramadan where she was obligated to fast. And what happened was she stopped for a day and a night, and then she fasted for 4 days after that, which were the days in which she noticed blood flowing. Basically, what happened during that time was a precautionary measure. However, it did occur in a scenario which prevented that fast from being valid, and that was the flow of blood, menstrual blood, because now we can say with certainty, look, that's her cycle, that was actually menstrual blood. And so what has to happen is she will have to now make up those days that she fasted, those 4 days. The first day, obviously, we knew, a day and a night. She didn't fast for that day. So that day is no problem. But that day has to be made up for fasting, not for prayer. The prayers that occurred during those additional days that we can now determine were a menstrual cycle, it's no problem, no harm, no foul. But the days of fasting would need to be made up. So again, for example, if after 3 cycles, she was able to conclude that her normal cycle is 5 days in duration, as described in the initial example above, and she fasted obligatory fasts like Ramadan, or make-up days of Ramadan, or fasts which were obliged due to an oath, she would have fasted days during her menstrual cycle. She broke her fast during the first day due to it being the minimum duration of a menstrual cycle, and then because she was uncertain of the nature of her bleeding, she continued to pray and fast the following as a precautionary measure. And after determining the cycle, we now know that in the duration of that blood flow, regardless the cycle mentioned above, she fasted 4 days of her 5-day menstrual cycle. And because it's not valid to do so, those days do not count and must therefore be made up, which basically is the example that I gave, just repeating it so that hopefully the concept kind of you're able to grasp that concept. They do not have to be made up in the event that a woman ages out of menstruation or the blood simply does not return. She's not able to establish any extra days of blood flow as a part of her normal cycle with a 3-cycle pattern of determination, this 3-cycle pattern. So basically what that is stating is that if a woman had not experienced any bleeding throughout her years as we could say a legal candidate, if we could say such a thing, for a menstrual cycle, and she reached the age of 50 and she had her first flow of blood, okay, then she would have abandoned foregone prayer and fasting the first day and then continued the additional days of blood flow. But when she reached age 51, she's no longer, she has aged out of a legal menstrual cycle, and so we would not oblige her to have to go back and make up those days, because we're now uncertain whether or not the days that she fasted were menstrual days. And so we're not going to invalidate fasts with uncertainty. Okay, we're sure that the fasting that she did was an obligation. We're uncertain if she did it while she was on a menstrual cycle, and we don't have that 3-cycle period in order to determine a level of certainty needed to now say, look, you got to make up those days. And the same thing goes for someone that even perhaps early on or somewhere in the middle of those menstrual years, she experienced a blood flow 1 cycle or 2, but not a third, and the blood never came back to be able to establish a cycle for her, a regular cycle. Again, we would not know, the status of those days in which she fasted, if she'd have to go back and make them up. So we wouldn't oblige her to do that. So that's the first scenario, which is min al-mufradat. Again, this is from the unique rulings of the madhab here, this particular manner of foregoing prayer, fasting, etc. for the first day, and then continuing throughout the duration of any blood flow, so long as it does not exceed 15 days. The next scenario for the beginner is what happens when the initial blood flow exceeds the maximum time period of a menstrual cycle, meaning 15 days or nights. And this excess blood is considered pseudomenstruation. It can't all be menstrual blood. If you're continuously bleeding, you can't have a menstrual cycle legally for that duration. So pseudomenstruation is blood, of course, which flows outside the menstrual cycle's time frame. And we've said the time frame is at minimum a day and a night and maximum 15 days and 15 nights. So anything less than the minimum and anything greater than the maximum is something else. We're not going to consider it menstrual blood. So in the case here that it exceeds the 15 days and nights, what do? Well, there are two possible cases, basically establishing some parameters, right? The first is that her blood possesses a variety of distinguishing qualities, which includes being thick, thin, dark, red, odorous, or non-odorous. Okay, these are just a variety of different possible qualities, distinguishing qualities. She notices those things. So long as the blood, which is either thick, dark, or odorous, these are the qualities which would determine that it's menstrual blood. Either one of these or a combination of them, if she was able to determine that it's either thick, dark, odorous, or a combination of those two or three, that blood flowed for more than a day and a night, but less than 15 days and nights, that blood would be identified as menstrual blood, even if it did not flow consecutively. This is based on the hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha, who said that Fatima bint Hubaysh came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and said, "O Messenger of Allah, I have irregular bleeding, which does not stop. Should I forego prayer? I have irregular bleeding, which does not stop." He said, the blood is from a vein, okay, and not menstrual blood. If menstrual blood flows, forego prayer, and when it goes, meaning it ends, perform ghusl due to that blood and continue prayer. And this hadith is muttafaqun alayh. So for example, if she continuously bleeds throughout the month, and the dark blood and red blood, you can tell the difference, alternated one day after the other, she would add up the days in which dark blood flowed and would get 15 days. Because 15 does not exceed the maximum amount of days allotted for menstrual blood, she would forego prayer, etc., during those days and pray during the other days after making ghusl. Another scenario would be if she saw there were 9 days of red blood followed by 1 day of dark blood, and that pattern repeated 2 more times during the month, she would have 27 days of red blood and 3 days of dark blood. Because the dark blood flowed for more than a day and a night when added together, it is considered menstrual blood, and she would therefore forego prayer, etc. during those days and pray during the other days after making ghusl. Because she can distinguish the blood types, repetition is not required, like it is in the previous scenario where it doesn't exceed the 15 days. If there's a noticeable pattern, however, if there's a noticeable pattern, there's a repeated pattern over the course of 3 monthly cycles of this long duration of bleeding, it can establish a normal cycle, which she can adopt even if during the subsequent months she does not notice the distinguishing qualities of the blood. The second scenario of this excessive blood is when the blood has no distinguishing qualities. Doesn't have distinguishing qualities throughout the duration of its flow. It has qualities of menstrual blood, but does not flow long enough to be considered menstrual blood, so less than a day and a night. So there's just some scenarios that are all lumped in the same case. I should say some cases all lumped in the same scenario, that either the blood has no distinguishing qualities, the qualities that it does have they don't flow long enough to be considered menstrual blood, less than a day and a night, or the qualities are not that of menstrual blood. They're neither thick, dark, or odorous. So in this case, she is to forego prayer for the initial 24-hour flow and continues to do that for 3 cycles. Basically, she just like the first scenario when it's less than 15 days. She stops praying, fasting, etc. for the first 24-hour period. Also continues to pray, etc. And she does that for 3 cycles. If it continues in that manner, she adopts the average number of days in which menstrual blood flows which is 6 or 7 days, the average number of days for everyone. If it continues in that manner, where there's no distinguishing qualities, or it's just not, the qualities aren't sufficient to determine that it's menstrual blood due to either time or the nature of those qualities, but the blood continues to flow, she's going to adopt the average menstrual cycle, which is 6 or 7 days. And this is based on the hadith of Hamna bint Jahsh. She said, "O Messenger of Allah, I have a lengthy and heavy flow of irregular bleeding, which prevents me from fasting and prayer." He said, "Observe your cycle with the knowledge of Allah for 6 or 7 days and then perform ghusl," meaning that Allah knows that your cycle is 6 or 7 days, and then perform ghusl after those 6 or 7 days, and then basically you continue praying, etc. This hadith was collected by Imam Ahmed. So, for example, in this case, she would forego prayer at the same time of the month in which she initially saw blood flow for 6 or 7 days, based on her best judgment. Is it 6 or is it 7? And some say she would use the women in her family as an example. What is your closest female relative's average blood flow or menstrual cycle, 6 or 7? And you would adopt either that, 6 or 7. And she would forego prayer, etc., for that time period. If she could remember and recall when the initial blood began to flow, was it at the beginning, middle, or end of the month? If she can't remember when her first initial blood flow was, then she would begin at the first of each Hijrah month, basically observing 6 or 7 day menstrual cycle, performing ghusl, and then continuing on forward in such a manner. And this should give you just an initial idea of what the first timer has to go through when experiencing the initial blood flow, and how to establish a recurring menstrual cycle. And that's where we'll wrap up with this what I would consider bonus content for our chapter. And the next time we'll be looking at pseudo menstruation, or al-istihada, inshallah.